Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight for our webinar this month. Our webinar tonight is presented by Dr. Sally Marlow, who works at King's College London, where she researches the science, psychology and culture underlying addiction. Sally's particular area of interest is women and alcohol, which is what her presentation is going to focus on tonight. And I'm sure it'll be really interesting. So I shall hand over to Sally now, and we'll get on with the event. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, and hello everyone. You haven't actually, you can't see me. I know you can only see my slides at the moment, but what I'll do is I'll give the presentation and then at the end turn the slides off and take questions if that's all right. So this webinar is called It's Different for Girls because alcohol is different for girls, and it's different in several ways, and we're going to go through that this evening. But before I start, maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about me. It would be good if I could make my slides go forwards. Hang on a second. There we go. A bit about me. I'm a research scientist at King's College London. I'm interested in alcohol, I'm interested in women, and I'm interested in alcohol and women in combination. I'm also a broadcaster and commentator on addiction for Radio 4. That's my website where I blog, and that's my Twitter handle. Today we're going to talk about perceptions about women and drinking. And then we're going to talk about the truth about women and drinking. And guess what? The two don't always marry up. We're going to talk about the differences between men and women. And the reason men are used as a reference point is because a huge amount of research into alcohol is done on men, which is great, except there are these differences between men and women, and we need to know more about them. So we're going to be looking at the biological, the psychological, and the social differences between men and women. And that's not just in terms of the causes of alcohol problems, but also in terms of some of the consequences of alcohol problems where we see gender differences. We're then going to talk about stigma, shame, and barriers to getting help. And then at the end, I'll take questions. So, alcohol and women, glamorous or grotesque? So, two stereotypes here. You've got the fabulously glamorous Kylie, who's there sitting in her champagne glass, and then you've got Patsy, for whom it's all gone wrong. And if you think about the way the media portrays women, it's always one or the other of these two. So this photograph, alcohol researchers call this girl benchgirl. This is a photograph that was taken in 2008, and the tabloids have great pleasure in regurgitating it every time there's a story about a drunken woman. Yet it was taken in 2008. I don't know who this girl is, but she's become kind of emblematic, to the point that, as I say, alcohol researchers are like, well, hang on a minute, you know, why are we still looking at the same photograph? Because things might have changed since 2008, and in fact they have, and I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along. I think there's a special stigma for a subgroup of women when it comes to alcohol, and that special stigma is for mothers. And that goes back from the picture that you can see of the babe falling from the breast is taken from Hogarth's Gin Lane, and you might be familiar with the bigger picture. It was the first kind of moral outrage that women were out and about in the streets and drinking, in this case, cheap gin. But what's interesting about that picture is it's often shown, and yet the picture of the woman is drawn larger than any of the other characters on the film, on the picture. Kerry Katona, when she appeared on This Morning, there was a huge amount of press about that. The media and we as a society like to point, and we like to have our scapegoats to point out, I think, and that's been the same through the ages. When it's a mother, there's a particular stigma attached, and we'll come back to that later in the webinar. So what's the truth about women and alcohol? And I would just say, anything that you're told and any statistics that you're given, you have to think about very, very carefully. I say that as someone who makes a living out of doing this stuff. Even I get confused by what I'm being told. A bit of history. In the early, as to why women are where they are with alcohol. I alluded earlier to the early 1700s gin lane. Drinking women then disappeared from the scene, really, from the historical scene. We don't have very much about them, apart from the Romantics, where there were stories of women drinking laudanum, which was a mixture of alcohol and opium. But then the two world wars, women moved into the workforce as a result of there being a lack of men in the workforce, and became more independent. And we started to see women drinking there. But by the 1950s, of course, we were all back in the kitchen because the wars had finished and the men were coming back and they were taking back the jobs that the women had been doing. But in the 60s and 70s, feminism arrived on the scene with increased financial independence for women. And by the 1980s and moving forwards into the 1990s, we were starting to see moral panic around the idea of ladettes, which really has a huge amount in common with what was going on in the early 1700s in Gin Lane. Again, it was women out in society rather than behind closed doors drinking alcohol. So what's actually happening now? Well, women do drink less than men, but that's not necessarily the best way to think about it. Consumption of alcohol is only one thing, and women are hugely variable. Some women can drink more than others and not get into trouble, and all the government guidelines are based on a kind of average, all the consumption guidelines. That's not to say that you should drink over the guidelines, and I should make that quite clear, but there is variability. Women have less problems with alcohol than men, and I'm talking about the population as a whole here. So if we look at the whole of the UK, you can see 33.2% of men drink what's called hazardously, compared to 15.7% of women. What does hazardously mean? It means risky drinking. It means what you and I might think of as binge drinking. 8.7% of men are dependent on alcohol, compared to 3.3% of women. And by dependent, what we mean is it's your idea of an alcoholic, if you like, somebody who has to have a drink. New figures are due out soon on these figures, because what happens is every 7 years there's a survey which actually looks not just at how much people drink, but what the pattern of that drinking is, whether it's hazardous or dependent. The new figures are out soon, but the trend overall over the past few years for drinking for men and for women has been downwards. Women's drinking, in fact, in the UK has been gradually falling since 2006. And in the case of what's known as chronic drinking, it has halved. Chronic's a really difficult word, because chronic feels like it should mean something to do with severity, but it doesn't. It means over time. So when the Office for National Statistics uses the word chronic, it doesn't mean drinking heavily. It means drinking large amounts over a long period. So in 2006, 20% of women were drinking above the guideline of 14 units a week, binge drinking, in other words. But in 2010, we can see that the level of that had dropped to 17%. 6% drinking to chronic levels, that had dropped to 3%. So this isn't something that matches the headlines. If you think back about that, pulling up that picture from 2008 of benchgirl, as a whole, in the population, so this has nothing to do with individual drinkers, but in the population as a whole, women and men are drinking less. And there may be lots of reasons for that, to do with the recession, people have less money, to do with the way the cultural demographic of the country is changing, to do with an awareness of alcohol and the harm that can be caused by alcohol, particularly amongst the younger generations. So does that mean there's no problem then, if we know that alcohol rates of drinking are dropping? Well, no, it doesn't quite mean that at all, because the problem with alcohol is alcohol problems develop over time as you grow older. So although we might be seeing fewer problems now in women in their late teens and early 20s, we are seeing problems in women in their 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. And what you need to think about is, what have these women been doing? Well, they've had several years drinking, decades in some cases. There are some differences between men and women, which it's really important to get a hold of. And the first of these are the physical differences between men and women. So those government guidelines, which we all keep hearing about, which are quite a kind of difficult thing for people to get their head around, but they are less for women than they are for men. 14 units a week for women, 21 units for men. Well, why might that be? There are four main culprits, some of which we understand and some of which we don't understand. The easiest one to understand is the difference in body weight between men and women. Women are smaller. Another one which is easy to understand is sex hormones. We know that sex hormones interact with alcohol, not in a good way for women. The third one, which is more difficult to get at, is this little pink picture at the bottom, which is a picture of brown fat cells. I know they look pink, but that's because of the stain which has been put onto them. And women have more brown fat cells than men. And there's definitely something going on with those fat cells, linked again to the picture at the top of the liver. The metabolism of alcohol is different in men to in women. We don't really understand exactly how, but what we do know is that the gender that comes out worst is, guess who? The women. So what's not fair, number one, and there's a clue, there are more it's not fairs coming, is that greater physical harm happens to women at lower levels of consumption of alcohol and over shorter periods of time. And in the literature, this is the scientific literature, the research literature, this is sometimes called the telescope effect. So women may drink less than men, and as we saw in the previous slides, but the problem is if you are a heavy drinker, you're more likely than a man to have bad stuff happen to you, even drinking those smaller amounts, and it's more likely to happen over a shorter space of time. And that's to do with the four things that I showed you earlier, the metabolism, the liver and the brown fat, but also to do with weight and those sex hormones. So that's the physical. Well, what about the psychological? The brain is a really interesting organ, and every time we find out something about the brain, we realize that there's a huge amount that we don't know about the brain. So we start with something which is, it's a quite old-fashioned notion, but I don't think that's a reason to discount it. Something that holds true more for women than for men is a thing that we refer to sometimes as the self-medication hypothesis. So this is the idea that women are more likely than men to drink to self-medicate some underlying distress. Might be depression, might be anxiety, it might be something to do with self-medicating after a traumatic event. So that's one thing, the self-medication hypothesis, particularly in response to depression and anxiety. There's also differences in the way women's brains light up in the scanner to do with how their dopamine works when they're put under stress. Dopamine is a chemical which is implicated in just about everything, but it's particularly implicated in all types of addiction, not just in alcohol. Then, for both of these two things, we see different pathways in the brain. So again, this is looking in the scanner, but research is in its early days. And the way we look at this stuff is we put different women with presenting with different conditions in the scanner, and we show them pictures of alcohol, or we show them something that makes them stressed, or we do both at the same time. And we look at the brain scans in women who are drinking heavily and the brain scans in women who are not, or we look at the brain scans of men who are drinking heavily and compare those to women who are drinking heavily, and we can start to tease some of this out. But it's a really difficult area of research because getting in a scanner is difficult enough for anybody, and getting the right people into the scanner it's difficult. But we're going to learn more about the brain, and that's exciting because the more we learn about the brain, the more we can think about treatments which are brain directed, which might be able to help with women who have alcohol problems. So it's not fair too, is that women are more likely to progress to alcohol-related mental health problems, again at lower levels of consumption than men and over shorter time frames. And so here's that telescope again. So the third thing that I want to talk about is the differences between men and women when it comes to the kind of social perceptions and underlying cultural stuff around women's drinking. So here's benchgirl again, but I also wanted to talk about Charlotte Edwards. So Charlotte Edwards, for those of you who don't know, led the England cricket team to the women's cricket team to their first ever Ashes in 2013. And she was interviewed afterwards, and she was asked what she was going to do to celebrate, and she said, "I'm going to go out and have a few bevies." And the next day, some of the tabloids carried headlines which talked about what an appalling role model Charlotte Edwards was. Charlotte Edwards, who had just captained the England cricket team to a victory in the Ashes. Now, if you contrast that with the way the tabloids love Freddie Flintoff, or other cricketers and sportsmen when they're out, you know, having a few drinks and it's all lads together, there's this kind of double standard which I think is really, really difficult for women and serves to stigmatize alcohol use and problems with alcohol. And then the third and perhaps most worrying of the sort of images on this particular slide is this headline, "The rape victim was foolish to drink so much." One of the things that I saw which I thought was absolutely fabulous was that one of the Scottish police forces ran an advertising campaign in which they showed some women drinking. And they very clearly, the posters, and these posters went into gents' loos in pubs, and the posters said, "Drinking is not a crime, rape is." So there's a huge amount, I think, that needs to be done in this area, because this story of this judge, outrageous, he accuses woman 18 of throwing herself at men. We get this time after time after time after time, whether it's actually within the legal system or whether it's someone in a position of prominence making the same remarks. There's something, and linking back again to the 1700s, there's something society finds very scary about drinking women and links to promiscuity, even when it's clear that there's vulnerability. And I think it's so complicated that you can hear I'm struggling even to describe it, because I just sort of, I don't get why we haven't moved on from this yet, but I think we haven't. So It's Not Fair 3 is benchgirl on the one hand, lads' night out on the other. And it's not just the media that hold these opposing views. It's society in general, I think. And that I find really worrying, in terms of the stigmatization that comes with that, which then can be a barrier to women who need help actually putting their hands up and going, "I'm over here, please come and help me." Stigma and shame, there they go. So the barriers, stigma and shame, are barriers to identifying that there is an alcohol problem for somebody. They are barriers to treating alcohol problems in people. They are barriers to acceptance of people with alcohol problems, that they are deserving of treatment. They are barriers to equality. They are barriers to dignity. I could go on, and I won't. And then when we bring that back again to drinking mothers, we've got the special stigma that we talked about earlier. I keep saying we talked about, of course you're not talking yet, but you will be at the end of the webinar. I'm doing the talking at the moment. If all of that weren't depressing enough, for women there's lots of other stuff which might be going on as well. And often it's not just the drink that's the problem. Excessive use of alcohol in women is related to many other factors, domestic violence being one of them. So if you think back to that idea of the self-medication hypothesis, there's a sort of unholy triangle that we see in psychiatric services again and again and again, between drinking and indeed other forms of addiction, domestic violence and mental health. Instability often accompanies excessive use of alcohol in women. Mental health problems, as we've already discussed. Depression and anxiety were the two that I mentioned earlier, but there's some other big candidates here that seem to coexist alongside alcohol problems, one of which is eating disorders and one of which is personality disorders. So with eating disorders, there are a disproportionate number of women who recover from, or who are in recovery from eating disorders, develop a problem with alcohol. And a disproportionate number of women who've been diagnosed with personality disorders, and that might be an antisocial personality disorder, but it might also be borderline personality disorder. They also have disproportionately high numbers of alcohol problems. Alcohol is a depressive, and it's not a great surprise if you are taking a depressant to levels that are harmful, that you might turn to self-harm, whether you're intending suicide or not, suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. Excessive use of alcohol also contributes to relationship breakdown. It contributes to social service involvement, particularly where there are children involved, and it contributes to involvement with the police and criminal justice. Again, disproportionately, it appears with women. So what's the good news then? Is there any good news? I would say if you think you have a problem with alcohol, or indeed if you know you have a problem with alcohol, and you're on this site and you're watching this webinar, you're already starting to address the problem. And women with alcohol problems can and do find a way forward. And the research is really quite patchy on how well people do in treatment, because a huge number of people do decide to try and address their problems and are successful in doing that without going into treatment. Now, because of that, that group of people is really difficult to research, so it's difficult to know how successful people are when they decide that they need to address their alcohol problem. And then all the research that is done, not all of it, that's an exaggeration, excuse me, but the majority of the research that is done on men. And it has always been the case that research is more, in all areas of addiction, is more heavily biased on men than it is on women. I think it's become a kind of a vicious circle, because more men are in treatment proportionally than women, more men get research, so treatment then gets tailored for men, because what we do in research is we find out what men need, and then treatment might not necessarily work so well for women because we've designed it for men, and so on and so on. If you do think you need treatment, you have got options, and it's a real honour to be on this site tonight. Soberistas is a really valuable addition to the alcohol field. Soberistas can be a fantastic support and a great aid to achieving giving up. Not on your own, that's not quite right, but without going into formal treatment, without having to get some sort of kind of formal detox or rehab or a structured day program or drug and alcohol worker, or whatever it is. But there may be some of you watching tonight that feel you need a bit more help, perhaps who are struggling and drinking heavily. And one of the things which is really important to know, if you're drinking very heavily, if you're drinking every day, all day, every day, if you get really bad shakes and become severely unwell when you haven't had a drink, you might need a medically assisted detoxification. And the reason that you might need that medicine to help you get off alcohol is because your system, your brain in particular, will be so used to the alcohol that actually to remove it immediately might cause fitting, and might, in extreme circumstances, can be fatal. So if you are a heavy drinker, get to your GP if you want to stop, and get your GP to prescribe you something which will take the place of alcohol while you wean yourself off alcohol over the course of a week. You'll do it not necessarily on a detoxification ward in a hospital. You'll do it in the community, unless you've got health problems like diabetes or a liver which is already failing or something like that. But that is a really, really important step if you feel that your alcohol problem is very severe, and you're as I say, drinking all day every day with that very, very severe withdrawal symptoms. The other thing is, if you are severely dependent on alcohol, you may need to follow up the detoxification with a structured day program or even a residential rehab. If you think this applies to you, please do see your GP. That's it. I think I'm finished. So if I can work out from this how I get my back to... Okay, so I press stop. There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks ever such a lot. If anybody does want to ask any questions whilst we're just tying up the end of Sally's presentation, just write them into the text box at the side and then we'll go through them in a minute. That was just so interesting, Sally, and so kind of a bit scary, because everything you described was so me. When I drank, I was just... It's really hard, I think, when you're the person who's demonstrating all those characteristics and you're falling into everything you said, you know, the eating disorders, the stress, the suicidal thoughts, the self-medicating. It was everything I was doing for years. And somehow, for all that time, I was still able to convince myself that I didn't have that much of a problem. But looking at your slides then and listening to you talk, it was just like, that was exactly me, you know. And if you'd have kind of known me 10 years ago, you'd have said, wow, you really do fit the mould, but I couldn't see it. It's very strange how you can delude yourself when it's you that's doing the drinking, I think.
I think that's right. And I think one of the things which is really, you know, alcohol's a bugger of a molecule. It really is, because it does lots of different things. So it makes you feel happy, it makes you feel sad, it makes you feel energized, makes you feel tired, and that's because it's working on lots of different neurotransmitters in the brain, and that's why the brain is so important for us to understand more about what's going on. So alcohol is a depressant, but at the same time as it's working on the bits of the neuroreceptors in the brain which are, you know, receptive to depressant chemicals, it's also over-excitatory, and it's removing inhibitions.
Yeah.
So that's why you think you're having a good time on alcohol, and then suddenly it can turn in a heartbeat, and you're maudlin, and you're depressed, and you're wretched, and you don't know what to do. And at the same time, alcohol works on serotonin, you know, which is the happy drug.
Yeah.
So it can make you feel happy, but then it gets out of kilter. And meanwhile, it's also working on dopamine. And dopamine is the thing that makes you go, I want more, I want more, I want more. I'm getting a little buzz of pleasure. So alcohol's working on all of these different processes and systems in the brain. And it's really messy.
That's very helpful, I think, in explaining why lots of people on Sober Easters say, you know, like, I wish I could just maintain the same thinking about alcohol. So one, you know, like you wake up on a Monday and it's like, that's it, I've overdone it this weekend, I hate it, I'm never going to touch the stuff again. And then by Tuesday, Wednesday or Friday, you've just completely, you know, changed your mind and convinced yourself that you've not got a problem and it's fine, and you're just going to have a couple of glasses and you can moderate. And it's like being, you know, multiple personality syndrome all the time. It's what we do one day just isn't the same the next day. So to get that consistency that's absolutely crucial if you're going to stop and become alcohol free permanently. It's so hard in the early days, because it's like your brain's just playing tricks on you all the time.
I think that's right. And there's also something that we talk about a thing called the abstinence violation effect, which is basically a long way of saying, when people do think, right, it's Monday, it's a new week, I'm not going to have a drink, and then by Tuesday they go, oh God, I've had a drink, I can't stick to it, I might as well have another one. And we do that with food as well. You know, I don't know, I've been on a diet and you have a dime bar and you think, well, I'll have another dime bar, and then I'll have a Galaxy Flake, and then I'll have a big bar of dairy milk to follow it. And there's some psychological process that we take the failure very hard. Instead of going, oh, I made a little mistake, and so I'll get back on track, we take it really personally. And
is that more so for women? Because women do tend to beat themselves up a lot more than men, I think. We want to be really perfect, and we set very high standards for ourselves, I think, more than men.
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't actually know the answer whether it's more that thing that's been identified, the abstinence violation effect. I don't know whether it's more for women than for men. I mean, you could certainly hypothesize that it would be.
Totally. I think on Sober Easters there's an awful lot of real kind of beating ourselves up with, having a slip up and absolutely, berating ourselves for that and really crucifying ourselves for it. When, like you say, that doesn't help really, because you just kind of, then you want to drink it away because you're so depressed and cross with yourself.
And it doesn't mean that you are lost, And I wonder whether there's something to do with the language as well when we talk about, falling off the wagon. I mean, if you've fallen off the wagon's off, isn't it, into the distance, and it's kind of left you behind. I don't know why it is. It's one of those things where the brain doesn't compute the reality in the way that it should, which often happens in alcohol. So people underreport how much they drink. So there was a study done that found that that if you added up everything that people say they drink in the UK from lots of different sources, and then you go to Customs and Excise and say how much alcohol has been sold in this country, there's sort of a 45% discrepancy. So the brain plays tricks, I think, and of course the biggest trick it plays with alcohol problems, the label we give to it is denial, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think then as well, it's like if you can manage to stop drinking for a decent length of time, then you get the benefit of that mental clarity, at which point you can retrospectively appreciate what you were doing and how bad it was. But when you're in the middle of it and in the first few months, it's really difficult to see that. You can realize it and play it down. Even now when I look back, I can't believe I managed to do what I did on 1 to 2 bottles of wine a night, for so long. I just can't believe how I managed to live and drink like that. I don't know.
But the real thing, which is extraordinary, is how did you manage when your brain was under the alcoholic cosh to summon up enough wherewithal when your brain wasn't healthy and you most needed it to be healthy, to help you make the decision to stop and then stick to the decision. And this is one of the things which is really difficult about quitting, because you need all your resources.
With all the mental strength you need.
All the mental strength, absolutely. And yet the alcohol, and this isn't just to do with willpower, or the alcohol has made fundamental changes, not only in how your brain works, but in the structure of your brain, particularly in this bit in the front, which is responsible for decision making. So that's not working right for you, and this is for men and for women. It makes it that much more difficult.
Which could explain why something like, and this is again me, complete layperson, but Sober Easters and other forums like it could have why that is a successful resource, a helpful resource, because you can't rely on your own mental strength at that point. You haven't got any, so you're putting together a lot of people, so you're getting, what I mean, instead of relying on yourself, you're drawing from other people's experiences and thoughts, and they're supporting you and carrying you in that time when it's really difficult, when you can't rely on yourself.
I think that's absolutely right, and there is stuff in the literature about kind of what works for people to stop drinking, and I think what Soberistas does is some very, very important things, and one is peer support, and you provide that peer support, and we know that works. So that works in other models as well, and other models that some people might be uncomfortable with. Women in particular, a lot of women are very uncomfortable with the AA or Smart Recovery or those sorts of models, and but Soberistas is providing that peer support. but also a safe environment and the anonymity. We know that that's important for people, for a lot of people to get well again, is to have a safe space to explore what's happening and know that it isn't going to be taken outside. And there's an extra level of anonymity, obviously, with soberistas, because you don't have to give anything away of yourself. And I think the third thing that soberistas offers for people who are trying to make changes is you can't make a change until you've reached the point at the level of your motivation where you are absolutely motivated to change. And some people, and I know you, Lucy, talk about your kind of rock bottom moment in the hospital, or something's happened which has been a cataclysmic kind of shift about why you must make changes. But for some people it doesn't happen like that. It's a slow creep towards the realization that it's got to stop. It's got to stop. It's got to stop. And Soberistas provides a forum for people to nudge towards that until they get to the point that they say, it's a bit like giving up smoking, right, the fags are going in the bin. I've been talking about it now for 2 weeks, and now it's time they're going in the bin. But Soberistas provides a place for that. The other thing which is so important about peer support is understanding that what is possible. So when you feel it is not possible, to hear the stories of people where it has been possible.
Other people like you that you can relate to who've done it, and it's proof that you can do it. If they can do it.
I think what's really interesting, though, is you have created something here which, if you dissected the different components of it and looked at it from the research literature that we have on alcohol and other addictions, intuitively and instinctively with Soberistas, you've put together something which has a lot of components in it which have a good scientific underpinning in terms of them being in terms of them being very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly anecdotally, again, I mean, we have just, in that the research that we're just in the middle of doing now with the University of Southampton, and hopefully we've had a really good response to that, and hopefully we'll get a lot of these kind of conclusions in the more official, recognised format, instead of just reading stuff on the site, which it has been so far. But we definitely know it works, so it's good. So we have had a question from Fee, who says, it's interesting to hear that women are more prone to mental illness with chronic drinking than men. Why is this?
Okay, Fee, I think that this is something to do with why men and the differences between why men and women start drinking. So women, and I know these are gross generalizations, and there are individual differences in all of these things, but generally women are much more likely than men to start drinking to cope, to give them a bit of Dutch courage, because they are feeling depressed. Men are much more likely, again, gross generalization, but it holds true, to start drinking in some kind of risk-taking capacity, having a laugh, going for a night out, and it being much more about sort of living on the edge and taking risks and kind of dangerous behaviours. What it seems to be is, if you think about those two things, men risk-taking and women more likely to drink to cope, the men's risk-taking eventually turns in to that needing to drink to cope because they've got themselves into a mess with the drinking that they've already done. But women start at that place. Women don't have the luxury of those years where they might stop drinking up here somewhere. Women are already there. Why is this? The answer is going to be a mixture of the brain and society and how the two interact with each other. And alcohol, it's very, very messy to try and answer questions why. Also because they're different for lots of different people. One of the reasons that I study addiction and alcohol addiction in particular is because the answers are really, really difficult to get at. And the questions themselves are often where you find the illumination, if you like. So I'm sorry if that sounds like it's fudging it. It's not a straight answer, but I don't think we have a straight answer yet. We may not get to a straight answer ever because of this huge mixture of factors which interact with alcohol. What is interesting is when there are mental illnesses in men, they seem to be much more what we call the externalizing disorders, and they are the antisocial behavior, conduct disorders, the sort of the kind of the mental health problems, the psychiatric disorders, which involve going out, externalizing. Whereas with women are much more likely, women with alcohol problems are much more likely to have than men to have internalizing disorders, depression and anxiety. But that's also true in the population as a whole. So alcohol seems to ratchet it up a bit, but alcohol's not the whole story. There's something else going on. So that's the difficulty when you're trying to answer these questions about these straight causal relationships, is there's other stuff kind of coming in which makes it very difficult to disentangle.
Okay, well, thanks for that. It is really interesting, and I think that internalizing problems is definitely like another female characteristic that I recognise just through reading the blogs on Sober Easters. Women have got this propensity, I think, to just muddle through for years and years and not talk about, not sort of let on that they're really, really struggling. And alcohol's such an easy coping strategy when you're feeling like that and you're lonely or depressed. It's such an easy escape that women, and kind of couple that with the way that women have been sold wine as this kind of convivial, sort of harmless little tipple to have with the friends. It's not surprising we've got where we are. There's another question about hormones. Has there been any research done into that's proven a direct link between hormones and drinking? So I think kind of PMT issues. Is there a kind of, because
there's stuff around the menopause, which is really depressing for me because I'm 49. But there's stuff around the menopause and being able to drink less around the menopause. The sex hormone stuff is difficult to get at again. It just is, because unless you could sort of find a way to measure which sex hormones are being released by which glands at which time alcohol is being ingested, it's really difficult to get at. I can't actually see the question on my screen, but the question was, what was the question exactly, Lucy?
Has there been any research that proves a direct link between hormones and alcohol consumption? So I think kind of relating to PMT and monthly kind of.
There is stuff actually on PMT as well, and I think the best thing I could do is maybe write a little summary of it, just in a paragraph or two, and you could post that up if you like. What I wouldn't want to do is talk about it as though I know all the detail, because I don't know all the detail. But I could certainly I could post something up in the next 2 or 3 days which would answer that question, because I know the research is there.
Yeah, and it does come up a lot. Again, it's anecdotal, but I see that a lot on Sober Easters. And I don't drink now at all. I've not drunk for years, but I feel a bit crazy at the time of the month. I definitely notice that sort of week before I'm depressed, I'm a bit grumpy, I'm snappy, I'm a bit moody, I don't sleep as well. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that, I can recognise that now in myself as a non-drinker. I'm sure I must have been compelled to drink more as a drinker at that time to quench those feelings, because it's not very, mentally you don't feel very stable during those few days. So again, booze, it's an easy answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm sure there probably is. It'd be interesting to find that out, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on, the question's just disappeared. I think it was a question. I think it was a response from the person who asked the first question.
Sorry, that was me. I was trying to move things up.
And you read that one then, right? Okay. And I've just got one more question as well. You were talking about about detox and whether people needed to go on a proper and official sort of recognised detox and not do it themselves because the danger of just stopping. Is there like a kind of recognised quantity of like a level of consumption that would warrant a detox, or is it completely different for different people?
I knew you were going to ask, someone would ask this question when I started talking about detox. The answer is no, but what's a really big giveaway is if you're waking up and you're retching and you're shaking and you're starting to, you know, maybe not starting to see things, but that doesn't feel like it's that far away from you in terms of your experience. That's really dangerous. That is really dangerous, and you would need to be medically detoxed under those conditions. And it's back to the brain again. That's why it's dangerous, because the adaptations that the brain has made. I think of it as being the brain gets all this information the whole time, and it's moving around, and all these electrical charges going backwards and forwards. And when you add alcohol into the mix, it's almost as though that kind of springiness, alcohol compresses it. If you remove alcohol from the equation, it will go bananas. And that's why alcohol withdrawal is more hideous than heroin withdrawal. There isn't really any cocaine withdrawal. Benzodiazepine withdrawal is almost as bad as alcohol, but that's because of the shared brain pathways. It sounds like someone's arriving in my office very late at night to have people arriving. Never mind. If when you stop having a drink, it is almost unbearable, the chances are quite high. I'm talking about physically unbearable. So if you are shaking, vomiting in the mornings until you've had that first drink, the chances are high that you need a medically assisted detox, and you should get to your doctor. It's no longer the days where you have to go off to a hospital and do it for 14 days and not see anybody. It can be done in the community, where you see your doctor every day, maybe at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and where you get a family member or a friend on board to support you, to keep an eye on you, basically. And that's the way the majority of people are now detoxed. It's not in a hospital ward.
And just one more time point on that. If you did present to your doctor and you with that kind of level of alcohol dependency and requested a detox, is it an automatic assumption that social services would be brought in if you had children and you were a mother? If you confess to that sort of problem? Or I'm just thinking about, again, the barriers that exist to women who are in a dangerous, drinking at that hazardous level. Or is it like a case to case?
It would be on a case to case basis, and it would depend. It could depend not just on your own drinking, but on your doctor's attitude to drinking. Right. Because that's one of the other problems with alcohol, is everybody has their own relationship with alcohol, and that includes healthcare professionals. So it includes our lawmakers. Everybody has a relationship with alcohol, so everybody sees it through some kind of subjective prism of their own experience. So, you could also go and see your GP, and your GP might not take it seriously. Your GP might say, well, you're only drinking a bottle or 2 bottles a night. Although the majority of GPs would take that seriously if you went to your GP. I don't know the answer. It is a risk, because any GP, and obviously if you're in a GP, they know you, they know your family situation. It's something that not any GP, but some GPs would do some kind of risk assessment, whether they did it formally or in their own head, and it might trigger that. What you could do is you could try very gradually cutting down, but that's the most difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I know, because if as soon as you've had one drink, then you've kind of, I know now after 4.5 years of not drinking, I know now if I had a drink, I would want to carry on drinking. But I don't think it'll ever go away for me. I'm quite sure that's. So yeah, it's a difficult.
I think there's an organisation it might be worth, if anybody watching is in that situation and they're worried about that. There's an organisation that might be able to give you some advice on that, which is called ADFAM, ADFAM. You could try there and see if look on their website and see, because they're about addiction and families specifically. Right. So it may be that someone there could find a way through that. It's not a given that
but it is a risk.
But it is a risk.
Yeah, and it's kind of it depends on a variety of things that you can't really kind of guess until you've got into that situation. Yeah,
if you're already drinking that heavily, the risks to you are just so enormous. The risks to you are so enormous.
Yeah.
That I don't know. It's like there's a children's book, isn't there? Would you rather? There's a children's game. Would you rather? Yeah. And the questions are deliberately set up to be, to be irresolvable.
Yeah, I think AdFam then. So I will put that link up on our useful contacts page as well, because I don't think that's on there at the moment. So that sounds like a good resource that people can.
And Alcohol Concern might also have specific stuff about that.
Yeah, useful to know. Okay, and I think that sums it all up. That's the questions done. So thanks ever such a lot. That was really, really fascinating.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Hope you found that useful and as fascinating as I did. And see you next month. Bye.
Bye.